bit of an overview of autism and the strengths and difficulties associated with that. A little bit about supporting communication and perhaps adapting the consultation environment for young people with autism when they come to visit, and then a little bit about referrals as well. Is there anything in particular anybody wanted to add to that list? We've only got half an hour, but we'll do our best. Any thoughts? No? Well, if it's not covered, ask us at the end, all right? Okay. So I should start by saying that you mentioned neurodiversity, and in the context of neurodiversity, we see autism as a condition that affects the way that the brain develops, but as a difference rather than a disorder as such. So again, thinking about the strengths of autism as well as the things that might be a bit more challenging because of it. These are the three main areas that are affected with autism, and we'll go through those illustrating the three main areas. They're sometimes referred to as the Triadic Impairments, and in DSM-5 they've sort of condensed the first two, and so it's now more the dyad of impairment rather than the triad, but we'll go through each separately today. So I'll just say a little bit about prevalence. The figures there are probably a bit of an underestimation. There's probably many more people out there who have autism that perhaps aren't diagnosed, and we're certainly getting many more referrals these days, aren't we, for autism assessment. And we've just pointed out that we may be missing some girls, and Kate will talk a bit about the difference in girls and how their presentation may be a bit more subtle and harder to detect, particularly with many of the assessment tools that are used tend to capture boys better than girls. And just to remind you that autism is a spectrum, so we use the term autism spectrum condition. Subtypes such as Asperger's are sort of disappearing from diagnostic manuals to avoid sort of confusion. But we say autism spectrum condition, and just to remind you that every person on the spectrum is different and unique, and if you've met one person with autism, you know, that's just one person with autism. They all look very different, as we can attest to in our job. In terms of the strengths, they're usually very good at thinking differently and thinking outside the box. They're often people that come up with some good and creative ideas. They can often be very strong, loyal friends because they like to stick up for their friends and what's right. They can have a very good ability to focus on things of interest to them, and often have specialist area of interest that they like to research and find out all about. And they have good visual skills. So they tend to be better at spotting small details, noticing patterns. They're more logical thinkers than abstract thinkers, and often have good memories for factual information as well. And this is just a handout sometimes that we give to young people at the end of the consultation if we've made a diagnosis, and they can sort of identify themselves what are their particular strengths that may be sort of associated with autism. So this is the first area of the triad, difficulties with communication. So language may be delayed, but that's not a necessity. There may be more subtle difficulties with social use of language, sort of chit-chat, small talk, making conversation, knowing how to start a conversation, and taking other people's needs into account in conversation, turn-taking, showing interest in what the other person has to say. Often there are some unusual features to the speech as well, so sometimes they use more repetitive words and phrases or unusual words and phrases, or perhaps sort of sound a bit older than their years. And they also have difficulties sometimes with imagination. Sometimes that's evident in younger children in their play, that they're not sort of making up stories and casting themselves as roles in role play and things like that. In older young people, again, it's more being able to put yourself in the other person's shoes, if if that makes sense, which can lead to the difficulties with social interaction. Other aspects of social interaction, non-verbal social interaction, difficulty with eye contact, showing emotion through facial expression, reading emotion through facial expression in others, and using gestures to communicate. They can be areas of difficulty. Difficulties with friendships or relationships. I've gone on. Oh no, I've gone on. Difficulty. Sometimes it might be that they're just not interested in making friends, and sometimes it's that they are really interested in making friends, but they struggle to do it in a way that's sort of appropriate. And again, that's about not necessarily taking the other person's view into account. Perhaps difficulties in younger children, letting other children take the lead or take a turn in a game. With older teenagers, it might be that they don't share the same interests as their peers, so they've got less common ground and less to talk about. And they're possibly less inclined to sort of share their interests or enjoyment in things with others as well. The third area, any rigidity in thinking or behaviour. So sometimes that can be really intense or unusual interests that are not usually shared by other people of a similar age, like a teenage boy that's obsessed by the Titanic and wants to research everything about it and tell you everything about it as well. I should say on that, gaming often comes up as an intense interest, but I think we have to be cautious about that one because it is such a common interest in most kids. So you're really looking at is it above and beyond what's typical for their age? Often children with autism like routine, and they find it hard when there's a deviation from routine. So it's World Book Day tomorrow, so that might be quite challenging for many young people with autism because you have to dress differently, and there's usually a different programme for the day than a normal Thursday. Yeah, Thursday. There may be repetitive movements that you notice. The classic one is hand flapping, but it might be more subtle than that. Finger mannerisms you might see, tiptoe walking, rocking, pacing, but something repetitive about those mannerisms, unlike the ADHD where it might be more fidgety, restless, hyperactivity, that kind of thing. And in play it might be that with toys and things, they're sort of less interested in the usual way that toys work and more fascinated in perhaps something else about the toy, like some sensory feedback that they get from it, like spinning the wheels of the car, or they like ordering, sorting, lining up toys rather than actually playing with them. And lastly, sensory issues. So these can be sensory seeking behaviours, sniffing things, licking things, feeling things, or it could be sensitivities, and common ones are difficulties with noise. They might be very loud themselves, I should say, but they might have sensitivity to other people's noise or other noises. It may be to touch, often clothing's a big one, seams in socks and scratchy fabrics, jeans, they prefer tracksuit bottoms, that kind of thing. It might be sensitivity to smell, light, and food is often a common one, rigidity around food, and having a very narrow band, or not liking certain textures, or not liking foods mixing, like wet and dry things mixing on your plate. So I think that's me. Hand over to Kate.
So I'm going to start by talking a little bit about other conditions that can coexist with autism. So there's a lot of crossover with the previous speaker, because obviously ADHD is quite a common one. I don't have the figures here, but I think it's about 30% of children with autism would also have ADHD. And then other common ones, intellectual disability, coordination problems like dyspraxia, sensory processing problems, obviously, as Amy's just mentioned, sensory behaviours, sensory seeking behaviours are part of autism, but it can kind of meet threshold for sensory processing disorder as well, sometimes. Mental health problems are a really big issue for autistic children and adults, anxiety being a very obvious one, and depression, both of those occurring around 30% as well, I think. And just academic underperformance, so from school refusal, from difficulty with accessing materials in school. As you can imagine, there will be lots of difficulties for children, autistic children, trying to get the most out of the education system. So that's a little bit about that. Girls on the spectrum, we just wanted to put a slide in about that because there is this increasing awareness about autism in girls and how it might well be presenting quite differently. So in terms of diagnosis and support, we're kind of catching up really, as Amy mentioned. The tools that we have to assess for autism historically have been based more on what people might presume to be more of a kind of male presentation. So that's a challenge for us in the clinic, kind of trying to recognise autism in girls when maybe our tools are not doing a great job of being really precise. But also for you meeting girls in your clinics, we just thought it would be worth going through some of the things that we've noticed and that research has shown. Girls can appear on the surface to be more socially able. They tend to be, this is not always, but they tend to be good at mimicking and observing. And this is the case for all girls, that research has shown that girls tend to be more socially focused, and from an earlier age they're looking at what other people are doing, they're copying, they're mimicking to fit in. And then certainly for an autistic girl that might stand them in good stead, helping them to blend in, but what it does do is cover up some of the difficulties that they might be having as well. Sort of classic things that we might see are girls that maybe have one friendship that can be quite intense. It might be somewhat one-sided even. Even this week I heard about a girl in clinic who goes around becoming friends with the most confident child that she can find and kind of copying, and they're not really knowing the boundaries, and the other child kind of saying, look, I want you to stop, and the other girl not getting that message. So superficially it would look like that girl has a friend, but when you scratch the surface, all is not what it seems. Special interest is another, sometimes a giveaway in girls. So they might have interests that fit in quite well with their peers: horses, fairies, music, collecting makeup. But when you look at this in more detail, it's very, very intense. Their collections are large. They might really enjoy categorising their nail varnishes or that kind of thing. So they're just some of the things that we notice quite a lot in the clinic. So the next few slides are just about, we think that people wanted to know a bit more about how to communicate in a consultation session, perhaps when you're meeting a child or a parent and you're thinking about autism potentially, or somebody even that's diagnosed already, and how to kind of get the most out of a consultation. So just saying what you mean, being really explicit is a really important one. Avoiding idioms and metaphors, because they can often confuse people who are thinking in quite a literal way. The third one down there about multiple choice, closed questions. Certainly in our training as psychologists, we're encouraged to use open questions and let people lead the conversation. But often with autistic people, that's just not helpful. You have to be quite direct and maybe give people a yes or a no question or a multiple choice. Obviously, you're checking all the time that feels okay with them, but it can be very overwhelming for an autistic person to be asked, how are you, or tell me about your day, or questions like that. Slowing down is a good tip. Leaving pauses. People who are autistic often have slower processing speeds. They might need a long time to take in your question. They might need time to process, to kind of put together their answer. And small talk might be difficult, the kind of how are you, that type of thing. For a lot of autistic people, that feels quite meaningless potentially, and feels really hard work, and could kind of distract them from focusing on what they want to talk about. So maybe a more concrete question, if you want to be polite, about, well, how was your journey here today, or did you get here okay, or did you find a parking space, or whatever. And just checking understanding. I don't think this one applies just to autistic people, but often people will nod along if they're feeling a bit embarrassed and they're not really sure what's going on. So just checking with the child, with the parent, maybe getting them to tell you what they understand, or to give them a summary, just to make sure that information that you're giving them has input across. these points, so the first one is about the environment perhaps more. So as Amy's mentioned already, sensory sensitivities are a big part of autism, so background noises, now I'm missing out for them, I can hear a few in the room, air conditioning, a fan. These can be really difficult for autistic people to tune out, can make concentrating on a conversation really hard. People have described it as being like a noisy party, even though it's actually quite a quiet sound, it might just be difficult for them to tune out. So it's worth bearing in mind noises, lights, smells, and just asking people really if they're comfortable in the environment, if there's anything that you could do easily to kind of adapt to make them more comfortable. Bodily feelings is another one that is quite a common thing. It's not often talked about within autism, but it does crop up quite commonly that people might feel bodily feelings in a different way, or they might have a high or a low kind of threshold for those. So it's not uncommon for us to hear about children who are having problems with wetting or soiling, and it's because potentially they don't feel that sensation in enough time to get to the loo. They may have a high or low pain threshold. They might not recognise hunger, or they might keep eating because they don't recognise that they're full. And this might be also important for GPs in terms of thinking, if you're asking an autistic child or adult about pain or about a physical feeling that they're having, that you might have to kind of put the question in a different way, or just think about the fact that they might not be experiencing a pain or a physical feeling in a kind of conventional way that they can talk to you about. I've spoken about processing time already. That's quite a big issue for autistic people, and just being aware that you might have to give them more time. Even having 2 appointments for something is worth bearing in mind. So top tips: assume nothing, as I've kind of mentioned already. Just ask people what's making them feel comfortable. Things like not making eye contact might not mean that that child is not listening. We quite often have kids at the end of the morning when they've been with us for an assessment really wanting to look at their toy or their phone, but they're actually listening still, and they chip in, and that sort of shows that they are paying attention to what we're saying. It's just that they don't look like they're tuning in because they're exhausted and they don't really want to make eye contact anymore. And pictures, writing things down, just making things really structured for people that might be struggling to take information in. You can try different kind of methods, and pictures and writing, the beauty of those is that they can take those away and look at them again later. And we like this picture here just because it really does, you can have a look at that later, it does kind of illustrate the kind of communication overload, thank you, communication overload that autistic people can sort of struggle with. Obviously the autistic person being on the right there, with all the thoughts that are going through their mind. So I'm just going to quickly take you through referrals. This might be useful to lots of you if you're wondering not about how to refer to the autism assessment team. I'm aware some people in the room might not be from Berkshire, so some of this may be slightly different depending on where you're working. But as it says here, autism not usually diagnosed until the child's 3 to 4. But you can refer earlier if there are concerns and things are really quite obvious, even by a sort of toddler age, then you certainly can refer earlier. And we have a waiting list of 2 years. It's slightly less for the younger ones, but it is a long waiting list, so it's worth bearing that in mind. And as it says there, parents often express concerns by 18 months, so by that early age it might be worth thinking about investigating things further. 12 to 24 months, the sort of early markers: reduced social attention, so in kind of to and fro games, that kind of thing, reduced social communication, sort of less chat than you might expect, less kind of, oh mummy look at this, or pointing things out just for a social purpose, sharing things socially with parents or siblings or other people in their lives. Repetitive behaviour with objects, you might see younger children, and obviously this goes into older children as well, lining up toys, stacking things, playing with things in quite a repetitive way rather than in a varied way that maybe uses more imagination. But yeah, one of the reason why we wouldn't diagnose is just because there isn't a good kind of evidence base for sort of clear markers for younger children. So diagnosis usually just comes later on, from 3 or 4, but we see children up till 18 in our clinic, and certainly adults there's an adult assessment team as well, so it's sometimes not clear till much later on in life that autism is there. In terms of how and where, just the single piece of advice I'd give is to look on our website. It is pretty comprehensive, if you're in Berkshire, that is. That's the link there. Probably can't read it, but it is on your slides. And on that website there is, I don't know if I put it here, if you're interested in autism assessment particularly, there is a link for the autism assessment team. It has a very comprehensive few pages on referral criteria. And certainly we'd be looking in our referrals for lots of evidence of the kinds of things that Amy was talking about in the 3 different areas, so communication, social interaction, and the sort of repetitive, rigid behaviours. So if those kinds of pieces of evidence can be included in the referral, that's really helpful and just really increases the chances of it being kind of go to the right place, really. But the information on the website is really very good. The one thing we wondered about was on the website it does say about you need to see evidence of difficulties in the early years, which certainly is according to like the ICD-10, but we see certainly in girls and some boys that the difficulties often take a bit longer to become apparent. So we might see girls who get to the later stages of primary school or make that transition to secondary school. And that's when difficulties really start to become clear, so we'd encourage you to bear that in mind. And just some resources there for you to look at if you do want a bit more information. Local ones, Parenting Special Children and Autism Berkshire are both excellent and worth pointing parents in the direction of, and then some national websites and resources as well. I think that's on our slide. Do we have time for questions? Yeah? Any questions?